It's 2:10. It's time for our next session here this afternoon. So going to start off here. I mentioned it was going to be a detailed update from the American Hardwood Export Council. So another person who's not unfamiliar to our group and has spoken at many of our in-person OFA annual meetings is Mike Snow. Mike's been the executive director of the American Hardwood Export Council since 1999. And again, no stranger to us. So we welcome Mike and look forward to hearing what he has to say today.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if I can get my screen share going here. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that and everybody can hear me.
You're good to go, Mike.
Okay, great. First of all, thanks. Thanks again for the opportunity. It's a shame we can't get together in person, but hopefully that's not too far away. It's always difficult for me to speak after Andy because he is always so calm and so measured and speaks so clearly. And those of you that have heard me before, I kind of have a tendency to speak very quickly. I'm going to run you through an awful lot of slides in a short period of time, but you should have copies of all of these available to you afterwards. And again, what I want to do today is just kind of take a look at what's happening and how COVID's impacted, obviously not just the US. Andy did a fantastic job on that, but really what we're seeing in a little more detail with some of our offices overseas. And this you saw as well from Andy, that global GDP is where we have to start. And last year we saw, a biggest drop that we've seen, actually one of the biggest drops in global GDP that we've ever seen, absent a world war. The good news is there does seem to be fairly quickly, rebounding very quickly in most countries, the US as well. It's not going to be even across all countries. You have some, Mexico, Brazil, are struggling. The UK is going to be a little bit longer in coming back because of some of the uncertainties with Brexit and some of the confusion and issues that's causing. But by and large, we're seeing countries coming back very, very strongly from that. And if we take a step back and we look at all trade in wood products in the first half of the year, and unfortunately, we don't have all trade in world products for the end of the year because there's lags by many, many countries in reporting them. But through June, the beginning of the year, our total trade in primary wood products, was down 14%. But if you look at sawnwood, we were looking at 11 to 13% drops in global trade in sawnwood and in sawn hardwood, especially. And we actually ended up the year, the US at least, down really just 5%. By volume, which is pretty remarkable, and it goes to Andy's point about the changes that we saw in the second half of the year, and that's really what's going to be what's really going to start to bring us back to some level of normality. If we look, the U.S., we still remain the largest exporter of hardwood lumber. We are not the largest producer. I'll talk about that in a minute. We haven't been for several years now, but we are the world's largest exporter of hardwood lumber, although our global market share has fallen from 33% of a much larger market back in 2018 to a smaller percentage of a smaller market in 2020. So global trade has been contracting for the last couple of years, not just based, as you saw from Andy's. We actually had a larger drop from 2018 to 2019 than we did COVID related from 2019 to 2020. And almost all of that can be laid on the door of the trade war with China and our loss of market share there. So again, if we look overall, big picture, as I said, we had about a 5% drop in by volume in trade last year, which, given everything that happened, I think is pretty remarkable, and I think it does bode very well for some optimism moving forward. We look at the overall markets. Obviously, China is still our largest market, but again, if we look at pre-trade war, we're looking at about half and we'll get into a little bit more detail in a minute, followed by North America, obviously Canada and Mexico together, Southeast Asia, and then Europe, and then a lot of smaller markets there rounding us out. Just take a quick look at global log markets, because there are some interesting things going on that we can talk about. Our logs in 2020, we did see a drop of almost 12% in volume from 2019 to 2020 to a lot of countries. Not, China, we actually saw a little bit of an increase, a huge drop off. And here, when we talk North America, we're talking pretty much Canada, not really as much in Mexico. And the thing with log exports is that once you move beyond China, and we've seen again some of this related to the tariffs being implemented, in 2018, some of this drop. Did see a small uptick last year. Canada, Vietnam, and then really it drops way off. So you have a much less diversified market on logs. And if you look at China being the biggest one in there, this is obviously log exports by species. Can't really put this into context because this is to the globe. But if we look at China's log imports, so China's log imports from all sources actually in 2020 declined quite a bit. And it's very interesting because China's actually increasing their production of sawn hardwoods, yet their imports of logs are declining. And there was some talk earlier about a ban on roundwood exports of basically log exports from Canada. That's actually not going to go into effect, if it does, until the end of this year. So there are still logs coming from Russia into China, and you can see the Russia's position there just after the United States. But a couple of things to keep in mind: there's an awful long border between Russia and China, and we start talking about things like log bans, like log export bans, or referring to the legal trade in logs. And I don't think anybody really has a handle on what the illegal trade in logs going on. So it's interesting that we're seeing China's overall imports of logs from all sources, again, primarily from their regions, a lot of tropical coming in from regions close by. But what's happening is China is actually increasing their production of sawn hardwoods, of hardwood lumber. They are the world's largest producer of hardwood lumber. We like to think we're the largest exporter, but on a volume basis anyway, they certainly aren't. So here we have this interesting kind of change where China's China's production is actually increasing a little bit, and we think it fell off a little bit. We don't have 2020 yet. We think it fell off a little bit in 2020, but at the same time that they're bringing in fewer logs, they're actually increasing their lumber production. There's a couple of reasons for this. The main one is that we have a lot of this about 18 years ago when China put a ban on logging in natural forests throughout China in response to some of that horrible flooding that was traced back to the deforestation at the time that they eliminated tariffs on logs and lumber imports to the world essentially. There were a lot of plantations that were beginning, and some of those are beginning to come online now. Some of the faster growing things, particularly things like with a little bit of rubber wood, but also also eucalyptus is the main, is one of the main ones. So when we look at China's production, it's important to keep in mind, it's not just a question of volume of lumber that they're producing. They tend to be producing, lower quality, or at least less interesting species that are not prized as hard in a lot of the applications, furniture and so forth, that we see, American white oak and American walnut and some of the species we have. So it's interesting. I think no matter how much China increases there's still going to be a role for the U.S. as an exporter of sawn lumber as well as for logs, and probably it'll continue to be much more dominated by the sawn lumber than the logs, at least in the foreseeable future. Just want to take a quick look at veneer. We did see a bit of a drop off this year in volume by about 6% over last year. And in veneer, we have a very similar situation to the logs, where it's really just a couple of markets that dominate it. We look at North America being the largest market, followed by Europe. But when we look at North America, Canada, of course, has been our largest market. And we have seen now 3 straight years of drop-offs to Canada. Mexico is remaining relatively flat. And we'll talk much more about Mexico, particularly when it comes to lumber towards the end. But if you move away from those two biggest markets, then you've got a lot of much smaller markets when you start looking at it. But again, dominated by a lot of the European markets. And then you're seeing a lot of furniture manufacturers, countries like Spain, Germany, Vietnam, Egypt, major furniture manufacturers. We saw from Andy's slides, Indonesia and Malaysia. So we are seeing, a little bit more of a diversification in the veneer exports. But I'm going to spend the majority of my time talking about the lumber markets, and of course, we'll start with China. The one interesting thing about China is it's the only of the world's 30 largest economies that actually grew in 2020, only by about 3%, which is absolutely anemic. But Chinese growth has been decreasing. In fact, it's decreased every single year that Xi Jinping has been in power. And I think part of that, of course, is it's not going to continue to grow. Once the development comes, you can never maintain that type of that level of economic growth. But a lot of economists, and myself included, I think feel that a lot of the Xi Jinping's economic policies, I think, are really hindering China, but that's a discussion for a different day. Wasn't that long ago when our exports to China exceeded our exports to the rest of the world combined. Back in 2017, we can see where they comfortably exceeded our exports to the rest of the world combined of hardwood lumber. In fact, it's interesting if we look at the at our markets, our overall exports going back year to year, take a look at the shape of U.S. hardwood exports, particularly since the Great Recession. This shape of our hardwood exports looks very much like this, which of course comes from Andy and HMR, which is, I love these graphs that they keep updating on this, because it really does show sort of the initial changes in China. But you notice this shape. So our overall trade for all lumber tracks almost exactly to China. So I mean, it really kind of shows you how much we were dependent on that one market. And of course, when the trade war came in, that was exposed. We were exposed, as a weakness for our industry. So let's take a look at what's happened with our trade to China. Going back to before tariffs, or going back to the beginning of 2017, on monthly, we were looking, more or less, 200,000 cubic meters a month. We were kind of going in. There's always, towards the end of the year in China, you always have drop-offs because they don't want things arriving during the Chinese New Year. But we had this sort of high level of monthly. Once the initial tariff rates came in, beginning in 2018, we saw a lot of uncertainty in the market, people not knowing what's going on. When the full tariffs, up to 25% for most species, including red and white oak, came in, in 2019, then we saw, just a tremendous drop-off. Last year began very well. In February, the Chinese announced unilaterally they were going to reduce or eliminate the retaliatory tariffs on American hardwoods. We saw a little bit of a spike, and then we had the second quarter problems in China and elsewhere because of COVID. But then we saw a strong middle part of the year, and even towards the end of the year it was strong. And don't let this little drop off at the end fool you to think that we're looking at some kind of a downward trend, because going back, even in our pre-tariff years, you always have at the end of the year this drop off in shipments in December. And again, that's related more to timing of the Chinese New Year, and where essentially the whole country shuts down for a couple of weeks, and ports and everything else, and companies don't want shipments coming in the middle of that. So that's kind of why you always see this drop off at the end of the year to China. If we look at the species, this is what's where we start to get into some trouble and some imbalances on what we can produce as an industry, what the forest produces, and what we can sell. We had some very, very good red oak markets for a long time, but it was because China was a huge buyer of our red oak. And with this drop off, significant drop off, more than 50% drop off in our red oak exports to China over the last 3 years, that of course was creating quite a few problems. And again, one of our big pushes at AHEC over the last couple of years in particular has been really trying to push red oak to some of these other countries, to pick up some of the slack. We've had, I think, some pretty good successes in a lot of places, but the problem again, like with so much in China, is it's a question of scale. Increases to Spain, increases to Pakistan, it's great, but it just is just a drop in the bucket compared to the volumes that we lost in red oak exports going to China. The other thing we've seen as a result of the trade war with China, even in 2020, with the reduction of our tariffs, is that we've lost our position as the largest supplier of hardwood lumber to China. Back pre-trade war, we had about 30% of a $42 billion market. Now we've got 22% of a much smaller market. So again, we're seeing not only a loss of market share, and you have to remember in 2020, most of 2020, the tariffs were only in effect in January and February. So we can't blame all of this, but part of it, I think, is because once supply chains change, it's very, very difficult to get them back. When these manufacturers start working with their Thai suppliers, their suppliers from Papua New Guinea, or their European oak suppliers, it's difficult once they've made that decision, that change, to try to wrestle some of that market back. Is going to be an uphill battle, and I think that's sort of one of the lingering wounds that we're going to be dealing with from the trade war, even if we don't see tariffs coming back anytime soon. As you know, in the phase one trade deal with China, I think a very good result that we had as an industry is that hardwood lumber was actually specifically included in the goods that China agreed to buy. And we also saw that when China last February, as part of their COVID relief, they dropped tariffs on a number of items. Almost all of them were medical related, PPE and a lot of medical supplies. They dropped tariffs, machinery parts and things like that. Almost all medical related, except hardwood lumber. They dropped the tariffs on hardwood lumber, and I think part of that has been the U.S. and some of the good work that the Hardwood Federation in particular has done with the USTR to make sure that our industry is not forgotten in this, because of course we're the only ag community, the only ag commodity that really didn't see big bailouts and big subsidies coming from the trade war. I mean, at $30-some billion in subsidies going to agricultural products. When you look at lost business to China, only soybeans on a dollar value lost more than the hardwood lumber industry. Yet we saw none of the subsidies that the other industries got. Even ginseng and cherries and all this all got billions of dollars. The hardwood lumber industry, who lost more than anybody except soybeans, saw none of that. So it was very good to see that we weren't forgotten when it came. The good news last week, China unilaterally announced that they are going to continue with the tariff exclusion on U.S. hardwoods through September of this year. When they took the tariffs off last February, it was for a period of 1 year. It was set to expire this past weekend. Friday evening China time, they announced that on hardwood lumber, again, the only agricultural product that they have continued the tariff exclusions on. So again, it's, and part of that I think is because the Chinese, as Andy pointed out, they need the fiber. It's not just on our side, it's, on their side too. They need the fiber, and their industry does highly value American wood. So it looks like right now we're out of the water, at least as far as having their retaliatory tariffs put back in through at least September. And then what happens beyond that is anybody's guess. Although it's one of the things that we need to be concerned about, I think, is that phase one trade deal, no matter how you look at it, and I think there may be a little bit of a pass being given right now because of the pandemic, but China never came anywhere close to living up to their obligations. These lines here, this shows what China agreed to purchase of American products, specific American products as part of phase one, including hardwood lumber. These numbers down here are what they actually did purchase. So again, they did not come anywhere close to reaching what they had agreed to. I don't think anybody, any serious economist thought that it was realistic to begin with. And that's without going into the fact whether we think that managed trade and China saying we're going to buy X amount of this, regardless of what market demand is, I think was ludicrous to begin with. But clearly they didn't reach it. So now the question is, how is the Biden administration going to respond? And I think right now this is being put on the back burner with the COVID vaccine and trying to get the economy back. But sooner or later, there's going to have to be some kind of a reckoning. And so I don't think we're completely out of the woods when it comes to the possibility of a trade war with China flaring back up. When we move away from China, and I'm not going to talk too much about Canada for the simple reason that it's very, very closely tied in with the U.S. industry. So we're looking really at countries other than Canada. The next two, Vietnam and Mexico, are the next two largest export markets after China. And those two markets have an awful lot of things in common. So we're going to look first at Vietnam, and we'll talk in Southeast Asia region. But when we talk Southeast Asia, essentially we're talking Vietnam. We did see, again, from Andes, we saw, Indonesia and Malaysia are beginning to be, a little bit larger players in the wood furniture export industry. But again, in Southeast Asia, essentially it's Vietnam, and we've had very, very significant growth over the last several years into Vietnam. And when we look at Vietnam and Mexico, one of the very interesting things, there's a lot of similarities there. Both of those in the last 30 years or so of those countries have become much, much larger players in the value-added global supply chain. So essentially bringing in imported components, making either intermediate or final goods and re-exporting them. And we see very, very similar trajectories between Mexico and Vietnam. And it's no secret that, or no surprise, therefore, that us supplying the raw material for the furniture and other industries, furniture, flooring, and other industries, that these two markets are going to come out because they both made very concerted efforts to be much more involved in global supply chains and in increasing their export industries. But we're also seeing some other reasons why they make sense. If you look at manufacturing costs, at the end of 2020, the average hourly rate for a factory worker in China is up now to almost $6.50 an hour. In Mexico, that falls off to $4.80, and in Vietnam, it's all the way down to under $3. So again, particularly when you start talking about labor-intensive goods, and a lot of furniture manufacturing, it does tend to be labor-intensive. That's one of the reasons that we're starting to see some of this shift in manufacturing, even from China now, to Vietnam, and also we're going to start seeing it in Mexico. And in fact, we're starting to see Chinese companies not only purchasing manufacturing facilities for furniture and others here in the U.S., but now with the settling of the new NAFTA, the USMCA, we're starting to see Chinese companies, sniffing around buying facilities in Mexico as well, to stay close to the U.S. market. So looking at what's going into Southeast Asia, again, primarily Vietnam, then we start looking at things. Yes, we're seeing an increase in red oak, and that's been great. But again, the volumes here where we're seeing the increase is so far below from the volumes that we lost into China that it's really not making a dent. And I think, we start talking about things like sustainability. It's not just the sustainability materials. A big part of sustainability is also making sure that there is demand for what the forest produces. And it doesn't produce anything, as you were well aware, more than red oak. So again, this has got to be a continuous push for our industry when we look at not only domestic sales, but international sales, is finding homes for some of this red oak. So how much upside is there in Vietnam? I'm very optimistic. This slide's about 2 years old, but again, it does show you that out of all wood suppliers, into Vietnam, we've only got about a 13% market share. Now, this is hardwood, softwood, logs, lumber, everything kind of lumped together. But it certainly does give you the impression that there is room for growth. But the other thing that I think gives me a lot of optimism in the future is that when you start looking at Vietnam's temperate imports, that's where we absolutely dominate. We're ahead of the Europeans comfortably. And again, there's some supply issues. We've got supply issues here in the States. particularly white oak and so forth, but the Europeans are having some supply issues as well. And as Vietnam is more and more involved in global trade, and we'll talk in a second about another trade inquiry with Vietnam, one of the issues they've been dealing with is the illegal timber. And I think if they want to continue to get access to the U.S. market, under the Lacey Act, into the European Union, under the EUTR, into Australia, into Japan with their green wood law, I think we're going to start to see them turn more and more towards demonstrably legal and sustainable wood, tempered, which tends to be tempered hardwoods. And again, that puts us, I think, in a very, very good position. So I am optimistic. There is still quite a bit of upside in Vietnam, even if their economy is not going to continue growing at the breakneck speed that it has been. But again, there's some potential danger on the horizon. And one, late last year, the Trump administration launched, a 301 trade investigation against Vietnam for two different things. The first is currency manipulation, and the second one was for its use of illegal timber. The USTR has not ruled on the illegal timber part yet, but they did rule that China was, or that Vietnam was a currency manipulator, but the Trump administration deliberately left any type of punishment or retaliation to the Biden administration. And again, I think this is taking a back seat to some other things that are going on right now, but we can't expect this to be picked back up. And when we saw what happened when a trade war began with our largest country, with China, I think that some of the dangers on the horizon, if we see a similar situation with our second largest market, Vietnam, we could be in for some pretty rough waters moving ahead. So we'll go now, the next main one, much like when we talk South America or when we talk Southeast Asia, we were talking Vietnam. When we talk Latin America, it's essentially Mexico. Mexico is the blue lines here going back several years. All of these little colors up here is everybody else. So, we say Latin America, but essentially what we're talking about is Mexico. And one interesting thing for us, when again, this comparison of Mexico and Vietnam and their increasing role in global supply chains, is where they get their inputs. And this is where Mexico, I think, for us is so important, because whereas Vietnam tends to get a lot of its primary materials and intermediate materials from nearby, China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Mexico depends very heavily on the United States for its raw materials, including its wood basket. So as Mexico begins hopefully to start to clean up its act a little bit, gets over some of the economic issues, not to mention political issues they're dealing with, I think the future is pretty good there in Mexico. And as we said, we are starting to see now Chinese companies and others, looking at Mexico as a jumping off point for the U.S. market. We saw, following the Great Recession, we did see some stable, if a little bit erratic growth to Mexico over the years. But this year, I'm rather amazed that it wasn't worse than it was, and I'll get to it in a minute. When we started looking at the species, Mexico has always had a very, very interesting species mix. And one of the things that we saw this year that we were puzzled by was a huge jump in 2020 in hickory exports to Mexico. And thinking there's, not that many more, hammer handles or rake handles being made. Where's all this hickory going? And we finally got to the bottom of it, where those of you who've been to Latin America, you see these kind of panel trucks everywhere. Hyundai manufactures these in Mexico, in Aguascalientes, Mexico, and they're using painted hickory for this, and they're selling these not only in Mexico but really all over Latin America. So that not sure how long that business is going to keep going, but for some of the hickory producers, it has been a pretty good business opportunity these last couple of years. But Mexico is suffering more than most countries from the from COVID. They're having very difficult. This is a purchasing managers index, which is don't need to get into the details, but essentially it's a measure of manufacturing activity. And you see Mexico not only took a tumble in 2020, out of the 30 largest economies, they actually ranked dead last in manufacturing activity. So given this, the fact that we've maintained our markets, slight decline in Mexico only last year compared to everything else that's going on, again, I think it bodes well for the future. Don't want to spend too much time talking about the rest of South America, because when you start looking at these, the next largest market after Mexico is Honduras, and we're talking, basically 3,000 cubic meters. It's not a lot of wood. Europe will go very quickly. I think Europe is an interesting one because Europe is having very similar situation to the US. I mean, not only developmentally and culturally similar to the US, but if you look at, this is Europe's imports of hardwood lumber from all sources. So whether it's, tropical and, US and everybody else, Europe's from the depths of the Great Recession, Europe's imports have never really recovered. And again, a big part of that is they're facing similar situations like the US, where things that have traditionally been made out of wood are more and more and more being made out of other materials. And again, a lot of the types of marketing and things that are valid here in the US are valid in Europe, vice versa. I think we're fighting the same battles as the European industries are. If we look at the markets within Europe, and yes, we'll keep the UK in there for now. Overall, not great, but again, could have been a lot worse. It was down, 9% by volume last year to Europe overall. But considering the rather draconian shutdowns in a lot of the countries there, I think that's not horrible. The UK, we have seen a drop off. The UK is going to suffer a little bit. We're hearing a lot of horror stories on trucks caught in ports and new document requirements and things like that I think are hindering, and it's going to be a while before I think we see the UK really start to bounce back. Germany relatively flat this year. Spain, as Andy mentioned, was we did actually see a little bit of an increase to Spain, and a couple of other countries, a little bit to Sweden. But I think what's interesting that, again, what we are seeing, and I think is good, it's always been a white oak market. We know what the issues are with white oak, but we're getting more and more Europeans now to start looking at red oak. And again, this was the, white oak's ugly stepsister in Europe. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to look at it. But I think those ideas are starting to change. And in fact, it has been changing for a while. A lot of people are saying, well, we saw a couple of bumps in red oak last year, but that's just because of where white oak prices were. But again, if we look back, going back 2014, we have seen for the last several years some steady growth in red oak exports to Europe. And even this year, we saw a nice little bump in Spain, Italy about even, a nice bump in Ireland, a nice bump in Sweden. So we are starting to see some movement there. But again, the volumes that we're talking about are nowhere near the lost volumes of that lost business to China. Very quickly, Northeast Asia and the Pacific, Japan's the largest market there. Japan has been having a very, very difficult time the last couple of years. I think they're on a long-term downtrend, but that's, again, a long story for another time. We actually saw an increase in Australia last year. We saw in 2020, we saw an increase in South Korea last year. Two countries that have actually done fairly well with the pandemic. Japan, while it's going down, Japan does remain a premium market. When we look at the average unit values of hardwood lumber sold to Japan, it is the highest market in the world. They are willing to pay, they buy a lot of white oak, which helps. But the Japanese are willing to pay, for the higher grades, are willing to pay for color sorts and so forth. So it's, it's becoming a smaller market, but it's still an important market. And again, Japanese design still remains hugely influential in the rest of Asia. And I think to a large extent, there's a lot of Japanese investment in Vietnam and a lot of Japanese investment in northern China. So that kind of determines what goes into to those countries. We look again at to the region. Again, Japan dominates, but it's white oak. But again, we're seeing that little uptick in red oak, and I think that's a good sign anywhere that we can see that. Australia, New Zealand, we saw New Zealand contract and Australia increase. A lot of reasons for that. One of them, of course, with the horrible fires that they had in Australia at the end of 2019, which of course seems like ages ago now. There's been restrictions in harvesting in some of the natural forests in Australia. So I think we're starting to see some interest there. And again, we're starting to see some interest in red oak to Australia. So it, and like Japan, it is a fairly high unit value market. And I'm going to end with some of the emerging markets. We start looking at the Middle East and North Africa. Way too complicated to get into the differences, but essentially you've got three types of of economies there that don't always go in concert. You've got the oil producers, your Saudi Arabias and so forth, that, as the price of oil goes up and down, we see fluctuations in demand. You have your countries like Dubai and the Emirates and Egypt to a lesser extent, Morocco, some of those that are more tourism driven. So a lot of it's going into the hospitality industry. That was a bad year for that this year, but hopefully last year, but hopefully start to pick up now in 2021. If we look at individual countries, again, Dubai has had a very, very difficult time, and we've seen a lot of building projects essentially put on hold in Dubai. Pakistan, a little bit of a downward trend as well. And then you've got the two major furniture manufacturers in the region, Turkey and Egypt. And again, we've had some difficulties. Egypt's had some difficulties with currency fluctuations, as well as some political issues. But again, I think it's poised, and I think Egypt is going to be one to keep an eye on. And we're starting to see, Morocco is in and around Casablanca. We're seeing more and more, particularly furniture manufacturing targeting Europe, coming online. So that's a market that's worth looking at in the future. And at the end, as usual, with India, we were so enthusiastic from 18 to 19. We ended 19 with more than doubling the market. Now, if you ignore the fact that it was only 4,000 cubic meters, I guess it's not quite as exciting, but we did see potential growth. We did see a lot of interest there, but again, it's fallen off. In India early in the year really struggled, but they seem to be getting back together. And towards the second half of the year, look at November deliveries to India, almost matched the highest from the year before. So we are starting to see a little bit of a pickup, and I think India, it's a difficult market. We all know that. It's hard to get into. There's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of inefficiencies. It can be a very frustrating market, but it's one that we just simply can't afford to ignore. Because if you look at overall, this is the largest importers of sawn lumber in the world, including the United States. We're actually the fourth. Look at India. They're actually they're actually the fifth largest if you look at it, because this takes all of the EU together. So if you take out the individual countries, that makes Vietnam second, US third, and actually India the fifth largest importer in the world of hardwood lumber. Yet we have a minuscule market share. If we look at from the first half, and again, India is one of those countries that's very slow in reporting its stats. But if we look at the first half of the year, India imported more than $100 million from around the world the first half of the year, yet we only had 1% of that. And I think we talked last year, start looking at some of these countries that are in there. One of them, the United Kingdom, you don't consider to be a great exporter of hardwood lumber, but they're exporting more of one species, willow, English willow, for one use to make cricket bats, than the US, the world's largest exporter of hardwood lumber, is exporting all of our species. So clearly something has to change. And we start talking, to build on a little bit of what Andy said before, we start looking at, populations and where future buyers are going to be. We're about a year and a half to 2 years away from India actually surpassing China, and they're on very different trajectories. So, we're looking at population growth in India moving forward, and the economy is taking shape, and it is growing. And I think it's one that we have to watch. It's not going to turn into China overnight, but it's a market that we simply can't afford to continue to ignore. And with that, I will end it and be happy to open it up to questions.
Well, Mike, as always, thank you for such an informative presentation. Obviously, nobody can put the export information out there like you can. I always appreciate that. We do have one question here from Mark Hazley asking, he's curious, do you know how the COVID pandemic is doing in other countries? We don't seem to hear a lot about that now.
Yeah, it is impacting different countries in different ways. We look at some that are having a very difficult time dealing with it, and I would say Mexico comes to the top of the list. A lot of that are political inefficiencies and things. It's a tremendous drag on the Mexican economy right now. And I don't think anybody has any idea what the infection rates are like in Mexico, because so little of it is reported and so little testing is done. Similar situations in Brazil. The other end of the spectrum, you have countries like, Taiwan, countries like South Korea, countries like Vietnam, that had, almost no impact other than their export markets, being, that got the pandemic under control, very, very quickly and saw very little influence, very, very little impact on, at least on their productive capacity. It did impact their markets, but their export markets in particular, their customer base, but not so much their capacity to manufacture. And you have some like India that sort of started out, everybody saying, "Oh my God, this is going to be horrible." Yet I think to everyone's surprise, they seem to have really kind of gotten their act together, and we're seeing rates go down, and we're seeing some pretty significant growth. So there's a wide variety of reactions. I think Europe, particularly countries like Spain and Italy, and the UK, the three that had the worst, probably the worst COVID outbreaks in Europe and the most draconian lockdowns in Europe. We saw Spain actually increase their imports last year. So it's kind of difficult to draw, any kind of coherent conclusions from how COVID is impacting different countries.
Okay, thank you for that. We have one more here from our past president, Adam Conway. It's kind of a three-part question. Mike, he asks, is there any annualized data by species and volume on how much of Europe's hardwood logs are being transported out of Europe to China on China-Europe rail? Does the rail continue to be heavily subsidized by China? And is there discussions among European countries to limit log exports?
There are discussions to limit log exports. I don't think that we have a way to pull out what came by rail. Specifically, we can look at Chinese imports of European logs. I think I've got Trip over here on the, going into the database as we sit here, so see what we can come up with. But overall, the log supplies out of Europe have been, I don't want to say insignificant, but they haven't been huge. The French are very particular about keeping their logs and their white oak logs in particular in France. But they have some of the similar laws that we do, where private landowners are free to sell their logs wherever they'd like.
Official log imports are down pretty much across the board. The biggest jump is from like Brazil, but even European countries in general are down. Chinese log imports were down 20% in 2020 from 2019.
So if you heard that, then European log imports to China were down 20% in 2020. But I don't think we could. I don't think we have a way to know what went by rail. But yes, that rail, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, is heavily subsidized by the Chinese government.
Okay, and since we're a little over time, we'll take this one last question here from Rob McCarthy asking, is the dramatic drop in red oak demand in China, can that be contributed to European oak as a replacement?
No, the volumes of European oak are too small. And a lot of the European oak that's going in, particularly the French white oak that's going in, tends to be the higher grades, and an awful lot of it is going into China's booming wine and whiskey industries. So they're taking a lot of it and they're manufacturing their own barrels. But no, I don't think it's a question of it being a direct substitute.
Great. Well, Mike, thank you again so much. Always appreciate your presentations. I don't see any other questions in the box here, so I think we'll close this one off at this point. Again, appreciate having you here, Mike.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, folks, we were supposed to take a little break here.